Vivid verses.
The first time I noticed it, I told myself it was nothing. Hadley had come home from work with that particular tension in her jaw. Not the tired kind, not the stressed kind, but the kind that meant something had happened and she was waiting for me to ask. So I asked. "Craig," she said, setting her bag down with more deliberateness than the weight required. He asked me how my weekend was. I waited. I was sure there was more. There wasn't. I said something careful and measured, that it did sound a little forward if he'd said it in a certain tone, that context mattered, that she knew the dynamic better than I did. She nodded as though I confirmed something she already believed. I moved on to setting the table and quietly filed the moment away under probably nothing and went to sleep without thinking about it again. That was my first mistake. Not that I said the wrong thing, but that I didn't pay closer enough attention to what I was actually looking at. I'm good at pattern recognition. It's one of the things I rely on. But patterns require data points, and at that stage, I only had one. You can't draw a line through a single point. You can only wait for the next one to appear. The next one appeared about 3 weeks later. Her colleague, a man named Femi, who I'd met twice at departmental gatherings, and who had the mild, agreeable manner of someone who had spent his life trying not to bother anyone, had apparently told her that her presentation to the leadership team was excellent, that he'd learned something from it, that she'd handled the Q&A with confidence. By the time she finished telling me about it, Femi had become a man with a pattern of making women uncomfortable, a person whose compliments were a cover, a colleague whose performance feedback was really about control. I sat with that for a moment. Femi, who brought homemade chin-chin to the office on Fridays. Femi, who I'd watched spend 20 minutes helping a new hire with her laptop settings without being asked. That Femi. I didn't say any of that. I asked what specifically had made her uncomfortable about how he said it. "It's not about the words," she said. "It's about the dynamic." "What dynamic?" "He shouldn't be evaluating my work like that. He's not my manager. He said he learned something from you. He was positioning himself above me." I nodded. I kept my face neutral. But something had begun to crystallize behind my eyes. Not alarm. Not yet. Just the quiet beginning of a calculation I didn't want to be making. Over the following months, I watched it develop with the slow, awful clarity of something you keep hoping will resolve itself before you have to act on what you're seeing. She filed a formal complaint about Craig. HR reviewed it and found that he had asked about her weekend in a team meeting alongside 3 other colleagues, as part of a general check-in. The complaint was noted. Nothing was actioned. Hadley interpreted this as institutional failure. She talked about it for weeks. She filed a second complaint about Femi, this time citing the compliment about the presentation. This one was also reviewed and closed. When she told me about it, she used the phrase complicit system twice in the same paragraph. I was doing the math, not out of suspicion, out of the same instinct that makes you check whether a bridge is load-bearing before you drive across it. 2 complaints, both reviewed, both closed. Both men I had no particular reason to doubt. Hadley's certainty remained absolute throughout. No uncertainty, no second-guessing. No, maybe I'm reading too much into it. Just escalation. I'm not someone who dismisses a woman's account of discomfort in her workplace. I know that real things happen, and that real things often go unaddressed, and that the people they happen to carry them alone for years. I take that seriously. I have always taken that seriously. But I also know the difference between taking someone seriously and abandoning your own judgment. Those are not the same thing. Conflating them helps no one, least of all her. The shift I noticed at her company's end-of-quarter dinner was more subtle. It was a small gathering, 8 people around a long table at a restaurant they'd booked out. I'd been invited as a plus one. I knew a few of the faces for photographs. I watched the room the way I always do, quietly from the outside, tracking the geometry of who talks to whom and how. What I saw was a kind of careful orchestration around Hadley. Her male colleagues weren't cold. They weren't rude, but they were precise. Words were measured. Topics stayed professional. When the table broke into smaller conversations, the men adjacent to Hadley engaged her directly only when she addressed them first. They did not reach past her space. They did not linger. There was a whole vocabulary of avoidance operating in that room, and it had clearly been learned over time. Hadley didn't seem to notice. Or, if she noticed, she interpreted it as respect. I excused myself to use the restroom and stood at the sink for a moment longer than I needed to, looking at my own face in the mirror. This is what managed distance looks like. These aren't men who dislike her. These are men who have learned that proximity is a liability. They've recalibrated everything, tone, topic, body language, to survive working near her. That kind of recalibration doesn't happen overnight. It happens after consequences. When I returned to the table, I smiled at Hadley across the candlelight. She smiled back. She looked happy. She thought the evening was going well. The conversation I'd been quietly building toward came on a Sunday afternoon. Not because I'd planned it for that day, specifically, but because of what happened on Saturday night. We'd had her friend Zoe and Zoe's husband Kwame over for dinner. A standing arrangement that I genuinely liked, because Kwame was easy company and Zoe had the kind of dry, immediate humor that made evenings feel shorter. We'd eaten late, drunk moderately, and the conversation had moved through the usual comfortable terrain. At some point, Kwame mentioned a podcast he'd been listening to, something about the evolution of language in professional environments. He'd made a casual observation about how workplace culture had overcorrected in some contexts, creating environments where casual friendliness had become legally risky. It was a fairly standard cultural observation. He hadn't directed it at anyone. He hadn't made it personal. Hadley had gone very still. I watched her. The stillness was the tell. Not anger, not yet, but the posture of someone loading. She asked him, with careful politeness, what he meant by overcorrected. Kwame, who is a thoughtful person and clearly sensed he'd touched something, gave a measured clarification. He wasn't talking about genuine harassment. He was talking about bureaucratic overreach. He said he believed real harm deserved real consequences. He was obviously trying to land the conversation somewhere safe. Hadley asked him to give an example. He gave a mild, anonymous one, a hypothetical about a compliment in a meeting. She said, "That doesn't sound hypothetical." The temperature in the room changed. I stepped in, smoothly, naturally, redirecting the conversation to something Zoe had mentioned earlier about a renovation she and Kwame were doing. Zoe picked it up gratefully. Kwame followed. The moment passed. But later, after they'd left, Hadley said he was doing what they all do, making the victim the problem. I said he was talking about a policy abstraction. He wasn't talking about you. He brought up the exact situation I've been dealing with. He didn't know about your situation. You haven't told Zoe any of it. A pause. Then he knew. And there it is. That's the move I've been watching develop for months. The one where intention becomes irrelevant, where coincidence becomes evidence, where a man saying a thing means he must have known. There's no falsifiability to it. Any denial becomes proof of the denial strategy. Any defense becomes proof of the defense's necessity. It's a closed loop. I didn't say that. I said I was tired and wanted to get some sleep. But lying in bed that night, I ran through everything I'd filed away over the previous months, and for the first time I arranged them in chronological order and looked at the complete picture rather than the individual frames. Craig, Femi, the dinner, Kwame, the casual statements at work she'd reported to me with mounting conviction. A man who said good morning to everyone, but the way he said it to her was different. A man who held the door and then turned away too quickly. A man who CC'd her on an email in a way that felt like surveillance. I thought about the calls I'd had with her brother Soren, who had quietly mentioned that family dinners were starting to feel monitored, and that their dad had said the wrong thing at Easter and hadn't fully recovered from it yet. Her father is a gentle, self-effacing man who apologizes for taking up space. I thought about how I had changed my own behavior in ways I hadn't consciously tracked, how I'd started choosing words more carefully around her, how I'd begun doing a quick mental scan before speaking about anything adjacent to gender, how I'd felt a low-level relief on the evenings she came home calm. I lay there in the dark and noted that I was afraid to say certain things to my own partner. That's the data point I needed. Not the complaints, not the accusations, not even the dinner. It's this. I have been managing my language to avoid triggering something in my own home. That's not a relationship. That's a managed distance. The same thing I watch her colleagues do from across a restaurant table. I've been doing it here in my own bed for months. I slept very little. When I woke up the next morning, I knew what I was going to do. I waited until the afternoon, after she'd had coffee, after she'd done some reading, after the day had settled into a comfortable middle register. I didn't want to ambush her. I wanted the conversation to happen in the clearest possible light. She was sitting at the kitchen table with her laptop when I pulled out the chair across from her and I sat down. She looked up. Read my face. What's wrong? Nothing's wrong, I said. I want to talk to you about something, and I want to do it properly. She closed the laptop. She gave me her full attention. That was one of the things I'd always respected about her. When she decided to be present, she was genuinely present. I said, I've been watching something develop over the past several months, and I haven't said anything because I kept waiting to see if I was misreading it. I don't think I'm misreading it anymore. She waited. Neutral. The complaints at work? Craig, then Femi. The conversation at dinner last night, and how you read what Kwame said. The way things have been landing at home. I've been doing an accounting of all of it, and the picture it makes concerns me. What picture? That the framework you're using to understand what's happening around you has started to explain everything in one direction. Every interaction becomes evidence of a threat. Every man becomes a case. Every coincidence becomes confirmation. She said nothing for a moment. Then, you think I'm making things up? No, I think you're certain. Those are different things. I can't assess whether Craig's tone was inappropriate because I wasn't there. I can't assess Femi's intent, but I can assess what I saw at dinner on Friday. 8 people who have clearly spent a long time learning exactly how much space to give you. I can assess last night where a man made a general cultural observation and you concluded he had targeted you specifically. And I can assess the fact that I've been choosing my words around you for months because I'm concerned about how they'll land. Her expression changed. Not to anger, not yet. To something more controlled and more opaque. So you've been keeping a file on me. I've been paying attention. That's what people who care about each other do. And your conclusion is that I'm the problem. I kept my voice even. My conclusion is that something has happened to how you're reading the world, and that it's making your world smaller, and that everyone in your life is starting to respond to it the same way, by pulling back and managing the distance. And I don't want to be part of that pattern. I want to be the person who tells you while there's still something to tell. She looked at me for a long moment. Then she said, I've heard everything you just said, and I want you to notice that the way you're framing this, me as the unreliable narrator of my own experience, is exactly the dynamic I've been describing. You're doing what they all do. There it is. The framework absorbs everything. My concern becomes evidence. My observation becomes participation in the pattern she's identified. There's no outside of the loop. You either agree or you become part of what she's defending against. I stayed still. I let the silence hold for a few seconds. Then I said, I expected you might say something like that. And I want to be honest with you. I've thought about whether I could be wrong. I've genuinely considered that. But here's what I keep coming back to. Craig asked about your weekend in a group check-in. Femi said your presentation was excellent. Kwame made a policy observation he'd clearly been thinking about before dinner. Your father said something at Easter that I still haven't been told the details of. Your colleagues at that dinner looked like people who had been trained by consequences. And I, your partner, who has never given you a reason to question my intentions, have been editing myself around you for months. I paused. If all of those people are part of the same pattern, then either every man in your life has independently decided to target you, or the framework you're using to understand them has a problem. I'm not saying your experiences aren't real. I'm saying your interpretations of them may have drifted from what's actually happening. She said, very quietly, I thought you were different. I'm different. I'm telling you the truth instead of going silent. I'm having this conversation instead of just pulling back like everyone else did. That's the difference. She said, so what do you want from me? What's the ask? I want you to consider that the isolation you've been feeling at work might not be entirely the product of other people's behavior. I want you to talk to someone, a professional, not me, about the framework you're operating in. I want to be able to have a conversation in our home without doing a mental check before every sentence. Those are the things I want. She closed her eyes briefly. When she opened them, her voice was level in the way that meant she was working hard to keep it that way. You're telling me to question my own perception. You're telling me that my responses to legitimate experiences are the problem. You understand how that sounds. I understand how it sounds. I also know what I've watched happen for the past several months. I'm not asking you to doubt your experiences. I'm asking you to consider whether the conclusions you're drawing from them have become fixed in a way that isn't serving you. And if I don't agree, this is the moment. Not a threat, not an ultimatum dressed up as concern. Just clarity. She deserves clarity. Then I think we're going to have a real problem. Because I can't spend the rest of my life being assessed. I can't be a person who edits himself at home. I can't watch you file complaints about men for saying good morning while I pretend I don't see what that's costing you. I love you too much to be complicit in that. The room was very quiet. She looked at me with an expression I couldn't fully read. There was something in it that might have been the early edge of real consideration, but there was also something that might have been the hardening of a decision. She said, I need some time to think. Okay. I'd like you to give me some space this evening. I could do that. I got up, put on my jacket, and went for a walk. Not because I needed air, though the air helped, but because I had said everything I had to say, and the next move was entirely hers, and hovering over it would only contaminate it. I've done the calculation. I'm not angry. I'm not hoping she has a specific reaction. What I want is honest. I want her to look at the picture I've described and find something real in it. But I can't want it for her. The only thing I control now is whether I stay true to what I said, whether I mean it. I walked for nearly an hour. I stopped at a bench near a path that ran beside some water and sat with my hands in my jacket pockets watching the light work its way through the trees at the edge of the path. I thought about the version of this conversation I'd imagined having a dozen times and hadn't. All the moments I'd let pass because I'd told myself it was too early or too raw or that she would get there on her own. I thought about how much longer I'd have waited if last night hadn't happened, if Kwame hadn't said what he said, if I hadn't seen her make that leap in real time, if I hadn't recognized the exact same architecture I'd been watching her build at work, now being assembled inside our dinner table conversation. I thought about Zoe, who'd sent me a message that morning, just a brief one, nothing specific, but checking in the way people do when something sits with them after they leave. I'd replied that we were fine and that it was good to see her. I didn't know yet if that was true. What I do know, I said the true thing. I said it without anger, without a performance of patience, without positioning myself as the wrong party. I said it because it needed to be said and because I'm not willing to keep watching her disappear into something that is costing her everything while the people around her say nothing because they've already withdrawn to safe distance. The question now is whether that means anything to her, whether the framework can hear it. I went back as the light was going. The apartment was dim. Hadley was in the kitchen making tea with the particular focus quality she had when she was somewhere else in her head. She didn't say anything at first. I sat down on the couch and didn't fill the silence. After a few minutes, she came and sat in the chair across from me. Not next to me, but facing me. Deliberate. She held her mug in both hands. She said, "I've been sitting with what you said. I waited. I don't agree with all of it. I want to be honest with you about that. I don't think you understand what it's like to be in some of those situations." "Okay, but..." She paused, took a breath. "There's a part of what you said about the people pulling back, about the space at that dinner. I've noticed it. I've been attributing it to something else, but I've noticed it. I know. And the thing about you're editing yourself." She looked at her tea. "I don't want that. I've never wanted that. I know that too. I'm not agreeing that I've been wrong about everything. I want to be clear about that. You don't have to agree with my entire account. I'm not asking for a concession. I'm asking you to look at what you might be building and whether it's what you want." She was quiet for a long moment. The kind of quiet that has texture to it, something moving underneath the surface. Then she said, "I think I should talk to someone." There it is. Not a capitulation. Not a reversal. A single inch of genuine aperture. That's more than I expected, if I'm honest. More than the conversation earned by any right. "I think that's a good idea," I said. "Not because I think you're right about everything. I know, but because I don't want..." She stopped. Started again. "I don't want to be the kind of person who makes everyone manage their distance. That's not who I am." "No," I said. "It's not who you are." She looked up at me, finally. Her eyes were steady. Whatever was happening in her, it was happening quietly and without theatrics, which was one of the things I'd always loved about her, that she processed things internally, that she didn't perform her reconsiderations. She said, "I'm still angry at you for how you said it." "Fair. You were very clinical. Would a different delivery have landed better?" A long pause. Then, almost reluctantly, "Probably not." I nodded. She got up and refilled her tea. She stood at the counter for a moment with her back to me, and I let her have that. I don't know what happens next. I genuinely don't. She might make an appointment and keep it. She might make an appointment and cancel it. She might sit with this for a week and then reconstruct the framework she arrived with and absorb what I said into the catalog of things men have done to undermine her. I can't control that. What I controlled was the conversation. What I said and how I said it. What I know is that I'm not going to pretend I didn't see what I saw. I'm not going to pull back in a managed distance and let the thing grow. I'm not that kind of person, and she deserves better than that kind of silence. The next move is hers. She came back to the chair, sat down, tucked her feet up. She looked at me over the rim of her mug. "Are we okay?" she asked. I thought about it honestly before I answered. Not to make her wait, but because she deserved an honest answer and not a reflexive one. "I think we could be," I said. "I think that's why I said any of this." She nodded slowly. Outside, the sky had finished its shift from gold to the deep blue that preceded dark. The apartment settled around us with its ordinary sounds, the refrigerator's hum, a car somewhere below, the small domestic noise of the building doing what buildings do. I stayed where I was. She stayed where she was. And in the space between us, something that had been moving in one direction paused. Not resolved, not undone, but genuinely paused, waiting to see what she would choose to do with what she'd been given.
Thanks for listening.